Hello, my name is Maggie Brunger. I'm one of four grandchildren of George William Brunger, who was chairman of the Great Western Medical Funds from 1917 to 1947. I'm here to tell the story of what we're calling the second crisis to face the Medical Fund Society and the opportunities that rose from it. I was the last of my family to live in Swindon. And during my time there from 2009 to 2016, I became increasingly interested in the fate of the Health Hydro, the building which has been called the Baths or the Health Centre, and which I've always known, because we were a railway family, as the Medical Fund. My dad, George Thomas Brunger, and my brother Alan had lots of conversations with my grandfather before he died, and they kept very good records of those conversations. So my information is drawn from these family memories, the Society's minutes, which are held in Chippenham, the annual reports, which are at the Local Studies Department of Swindon Library, and the Bernard Darwin's booklet, A Century of Medical Service, which has been greatly annotated by my dad. A little bit of background, George William Brunger was born and raised in Maidstone, Kent. He left school at age 12, and in 1899, influenced by an uncle who was a soldier, he joined the Royal Engineers, and by the end of the year was sent to South Africa to fight in the Boer War. When the war ended in May 1902, he stayed in South Africa doing engineering work in gold and diamond mines, and later with the South African Railway Company, where he gained knowledge of bridge building, which was valuable in 1921 in Swindon when he was involved in building the electric traverser and overhead cranes in the main erecting shop in Swindon. In 1906, he returned from South Africa to Maidstone, married my grandmother, Lillian Price, and they moved to Swindon for him to take up a job as a fitter in the GWR. So 10 years later, in 1916, they lived at 40 Kings Hill with 3 children, Lillian's teenage brother and sister, and because it was 2 years into World War I, like many of their neighbours, their front parlour was occupied by 2 billeted soldiers. So, and George was 34, which was too old to be conscripted, and he was, like many of the railway employees, occupied with essential war work. They were building big guns. By now, he was very active in the engineering union, and as the West of England representative, he attended conferences and organizational meetings, which did not make him popular with the GWR management. So we come to the second crisis. Although the medical fund had been successfully operating for many decades, by 1916, in the middle of this war, it was facing dire financial situation. Conscription for the armed forces had reduced the number of GWR employees enormously. And the medical fund income came from the contributions directly subtracted from the pay packets of their members. So that had fallen sharply. Because of the war, it was also difficult to find enough doctors, and the cost of drugs and supplies had risen enormously. They had a £4,000 loan from the GWR and £2,000 from the bank, but these funds were insufficient to cover their expenses, and the bank was demanding repayment. The Medical Fund Management Committee proposed a steep increase in member contributions to try to cover the debts, but many were wanting the society to be closed. And 2 trustees, Mr. Churchward, who was the chief mechanical officer of the GWR, and Mr. Braund, both resigned from their trusteeship. During the week of September the 11th, 1916, 3 general meetings for members were held in the swimming pool, the large swimming bath hall, so they could accommodate as many members as possible, so they could discuss this situation. The membership was furious that the committee had not informed everybody earlier that this situation was building. George was in London that week attending a union conference, but on the evening of the third meeting, he was walking home from the station, passing the bars, and heard an angry commotion inside. So he went in, listened for a while, and then spoke up, saying that it was grossly unfair to think of closing the society when it was needed not only by the workers, but by the families of the conscripted soldiers, and that those men, when they returned after the war, may need the society even more than before. He proposed that a small committee be elected from those present to investigate and to create possible solutions, and they would report back to the membership within 3 months. So this was agreed, and 9 men were elected with George as their chair. So there followed intense weeks of negotiations and planning, and the committee actually returned in November and presented their ideas. These were that they should hold negotiations with the bank and the GWR to gain an extra 5 years to repay the loans. They'd had preliminary talks and thought this was okay. And that membership should be levied an extra 2 pence a week, which was about half of what the previous committee had suggested. But most radically, there were 2 proposals concerning doctors and a change in the hiring philosophy of the Medical Fund Society. The first was that they would cut by half the salaries of the superintendent medical officer and his 2 assistant superintendents. This meant that they would receive about £1,000 each. The second proposal was even more amazing. They proposed that the salaries for the junior doctors, like the GPs, would be doubled from £350 a year to £700. And to ensure the success of this proposal, George had already had talks with the British Medical Association to assess their willingness to sanction the proposals. The thinking behind it was that they would attract more mature candidates for the positions of doctors. And that meant that they would be more likely to settle in Swindon and raise their families there. The management committee had generally hired young doctors because they cost less, and they had accommodated them at Park House. The new committee also proposed selling Park House and its contents, as it would no longer be needed as residence. Just a quick aside, about 2 years earlier, the minutes of the society record a riotous party that was held at the house, and Miss Hinchcliffe, the housekeeper, reported on the disgraceful state of the house afterwards. Gas mantles and crockery were broken, blind cords cut, and food of all kinds strewn on the furniture and floors. 2 of the doctors were unfit for duty the next day, and in fact 4 of them were fired because of this party. So back to the proposals. These were actually accepted by the general membership, and 11 of the 15-member management committee resigned. So elections for a new committee were planned and held, and that new management committee held its first meeting in March of 1917, and George Brunger was elected chairperson. Superintendent Medical Officer Dr. Rodway Swinhoe demanded arbitration from the BMA because he did not like, and neither did the other 2 superintendents, the decision to cut their pay. However, in December of 1917, the BMA decided with the committee, and that caused a huge row between the Medical Fund Committee and the GWR company. George remembered that things looked black for him. He was called in to explain to Chief Medical Officer, Engineer Officer, Mr. Churchward, what was going on. And after, in quotes, beating about the bush for several minutes, Mr. Churchward asked George what he intended to do about Dr. Swinhoe. George asked in turn what Swinhoe was going to do, excuse me, since it was up to him to take or leave the offer of £1,000. In the event, Dr. Swinhoe left for a position in a military hospital, although he later returned to the GWR as a medical examiner. George maintained that this row was big enough to get him sacked. The wartime emergency probably saved his job, but he never really knew why he wasn't dismissed afterwards. Dr. Boxer Main was appointed Superintendent Medical Officer, and Dr. T. Berry, Assistant Superintendent. These were the two who had been under Dr. Swinhoe, and they finally accepted the BMA decision. Park House closed and was sold, raising £500 towards the debts. And fortunately, the use of the swimming and washing bars increased, thereby increasing the revenue, because military units were stationed in Swindon. So the debts were actually paid off a year early, and the levy on members was ended in March 1922 when the financial situation was secure.